Nature is a beautiful thing, but it's also a scary thing. While there are many flowers that are dazzling to the eyes, there are many that, despite their beauty, you should absolutely avoid at all costs. You might think the most dangerous thing out there is a hungry lion or an angry gorilla, but you'd be surprised by how dangerous some plants can be. These are the strangest plants you should never touch.
Venus flytrap. The Venus flytrap has one hell of a reputation, mostly because it's a carnivorous plant. It mainly relies on insects and spiders for sustenance and uses nefarious tricks to trap its prey. It attracts insects by exuding a sweet smell into the air. When potential prey shows up to investigate, they crawl along the open mouth of the plant, which is covered in little hairs. These trigger hairs signal the plant to snap shut, impaling and trapping its prey. If the plant decides that the catch is worthy of eating, it will keep its trap shut and begin digesting the unlucky critter. These plants react with lightning-fast reflexes, and anything that gets too close has very little chance of escape once caught. Oleander. Oleander won't produce the same stinging sensation as most plants on this list. Instead, it's worth avoiding because it's known as being the most poisonous of all commonly grown garden plants. Oleander plants have impressive flowers that make them attractive to growers, but they can easily grow out of control like a weed, choking other plants and taking over large areas if left to its own devices. Oleander toxins are troublesome when consumed in large amounts and may account for the deaths of people who accidentally use them to roast meat back in the day. Humans don't generally have to worry about dying if they've been poisoned by an oleander plant, but it can have a severe impact on the gastrointestinal and central nervous systems, as well as cause cardiac issues. Oleander contains oleandrin and oleandrogenin, which are known as cardiac glycosides.
Jimson weed. The Jimson weed is a plant with white or purple flowers, jagged leaves, and green fruit that grow upon maturity. It also grows to around 5 feet high throughout the US between May and September. To look at it, it's relatively inconspicuous, but you would be surprised at how many curious teenagers know more about this plant than any other. It has hallucinogenic properties that people are too curious to find out more about, and the result of that curiosity can be Jimson weed poisoning. Sure, you can hallucinate after consuming Jimson weed, but you can also experience a range of other side effects that are less than pleasant. People who have consumed the plant, be it on purpose or accidental, can experience shaking, mumbling, confusion, dilated pupils, blurred vision, hypothermia, and dry mucous membranes. In more extreme cases, respiratory arrest and seizures can occur. Symptoms can persist for as long as 2 days, but efforts to remove it from the gastrointestinal tract can minimize its effects. So while hallucinating may be something that seems like fun, it's really not, and this plant should be avoided at all costs.
Gympie gympie. The gympie bush is also known as the stinging bush or the suicide plant. It's found in Australia and is especially dominant in the rainforests in the northeast part of the continent. The gympie gympie plants have stinging hairs that adorn their entirety. If touched, these hairs inject a very powerful neurotoxin. This is delivered thanks to a small bulb on the tip of the hairs that breaks when it's touched. The most toxic of all the Australian species of stinging trees, gympie gympie bushes have small flowers and fruit that resembles mulberries. The hairs are hollow and tipped with silica, designed to break off and embed themselves in the skin before injecting their toxic payload. The stinging sensation they cause can last anywhere from a few hours to a few days. Sometimes the hairs can be dispersed in the air, causing nasal bleeding and throat irritation. One person was hit in the face and torso with a large gympie gympie leaf and said he was racked with unbearable pain for days, with the stinging sensation coming back every time he had a cold shower for the next 2 years.
Hydnellum pecki. Mushrooms are generally quite ugly, that's a given. They're often brown, wrinkly, and not all that pleasing on the senses. But if you find yourself peering down at a beautiful pink fungus, then you may have stumbled across Hydnellum pecki. Hydnellum pecki goes by the name of devil's tooth, strawberries and cream, the bleeding tooth fungus, and red juice tooth. All very original, we know. When this fungus is young, it's a brilliant shade of pink and red that grows around coniferous trees either on its own or in vibrant masses. Once Once it ages though, it becomes that more boring shade of brown we expect from a fungus when it matures. Hydnellum pecki is found in North America, Europe, and Asia. More recently, it has popped up in Korea and Iran. So why is it a plant that you shouldn't touch? We know it can be hard to resist because it's so pretty, but it can also be messy. They can bleed a bright red fluid, which can prove to be a nuisance in the absence of wet wipes. This fungus is not toxic, but it sure is inconvenient to touch while wearing white clothing.
Pain bush. African poison ivy is pretty much the African equivalent of the American poison ivy. It's also generally referred to as the pain bush by people who live in areas where they thrive. Very much like poison ivy, the sap in this plant contains organic compounds that are toxic and react when they come in contact with the skin. The plants vary a lot in size, sometimes presenting as a small shrub that stands around 1 to 2 feet tall. Other times, these plants can grow to be up to 6 meters, towering over the landscape. Regardless of size, the pain bush produces small flowers that are a creamy green in color. When its twigs are damaged, the pain bush produces a creamy sap, much like the milkweed plant, which is highly poisonous. Found mostly in central to southern Africa, the pain bush also has very sharply toothed leaves, which its name is based on. The pain bush was first described after being discovered in Pondoland, South Africa by J.F. Dredge and Andrew Smith back in 1832. Although people already living in the area were already well acquainted with the pain bush for generations at that point.
Death cap. Foraging has been a popular way to get food for generations. And even though we know we have supermarkets, there's nothing quite like heading out into the wilderness and collecting your own snacks. But if you live in California or anywhere that death cap mushrooms grow, then don't be in too much of a hurry to make that big pot of mushroom soup. The death cap mushroom is a poisonous mushroom that is often mistaken for the harmless and edible paddy straws and cocora mushrooms. It's so similar that even expert mycologists don't always know whether the mushroom they have picked is a young death cap or a mature type of the edible variety. They have round yellow and green caps, a smooth top in the shape of a cup, and gills on the underside to help the mushroom reproduce. Some of these features also appear on fungi of the edible variety. The difference is death caps can kill you. While you might feel fine, a toxin from the mushroom is slowly damaging your liver cells. You might then experience vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and fluid loss. Eventually, you may suffer from liver failure and even death. Every year, dozens of people are treated for death cap poisoning, and many succumb to their illness. It might just be best to buy fresh mushrooms from your local grocery store to avoid the risk.
Spanish bayonet. This name is used to describe a variety of plants, all of which can cause serious injury if you happen to get too close. We're going to focus on the Hespero yucca whipplei that traditionally grows in the southern United States. That said, it can be found in specialist nurseries all over the world, despite the fact that it's hard to grow outside of its native range. These plants were widely used by Native Americans as a food source, along with a solid source of fiber. People used yucca plants over 5,000 years ago, giving it a relatively rich history, despite it being relatively unknown today. These particular Spanish bayonet plants are pollinated by the California yucca moth as part of a symbiotic relationship. Spanish bayonets are notably dangerous to passers-by because their long leaves have needle-sharp tips. Many varieties of Spanish bayonet also have spines running down the length of their leaves, which are long and rigid. The leaf edges are also saw-toothed, so you can easily injure yourself on one of them even if you're being especially careful. Plants named Spanish bayonet can be found all over the world, and all of them have the same needle-like tips on the ends of their leaves, which act as an effective defense mechanism for the most part.
Conocybe phalaris. During late fall to midwinter, you may stumble across the Conocybe phalaris California fungi in scattered soil near woody debris. This delicious-looking mushroom may produce visions in your head of mushroom soups and steak and mushroom pies, but it shouldn't. Instead, it should evoke images of hospital visits and illnesses. The Conocybe phalaris mushroom is a butterscotch to brown-colored fungus with gills and a broad cup on the top. If you didn't know any better, you'd think it was a delicious and nutritious treat to fill hungry tummies. But the only thing your tummy is going to be feeling is sick. This mushroom contains deadly amatoxins. Even cooking the fungus doesn't get rid of them. If you consume this mushroom, you can experience liver and kidney damage, not to mention headaches, dizziness, respiratory tract irritation, coughing, nausea, back pain, and more. Fortunately for hunters and gatherers, the Conocybe phalaris is not all that common, which means the chances of mistaking it for an edible type is slim. Slim, but not impossible. Take care while out foraging by bringing along your local mushroom expert or a handy book on mushroom varieties that won't kill you.
Poison ivy. Another unfortunate plant to have nearby if you happen to have to relieve yourself in the woods is poison ivy. This plant grows all over Asia and North America and causes an intense contact dermatitis rash. This is caused by a chemical compound named urushiol that is present in the plant's sap. Leaves are smooth and have no stinging hairs, but poison ivy ranks among the most troublesome plants for hikers and campers all over the world. Interestingly, the urushiol compound in poison ivy isn't meant to be used as a defense mechanism. It's instead there to help the plant retain water. Poison ivy is routinely eaten by deer and bears, so it seems that they have some sort of immunity that we don't. But when it comes right down to it, poison ivy just wants to stay hydrated and doesn't mean any trouble. That's probably not much comfort to the many people who come in contact with this plant every year, as the itchy rash can be quite painful and sometimes lasts for days or weeks if it's bad enough. People who enjoy the outdoors are almost always on the lookout for this itch-inducing plant and try to avoid it if they can help it. The manchineel plant is native to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico and has very attractive and sweet-smelling fruit. They resemble apples to a certain extent, and many people have found themselves poisoned when they accidentally ingest them without realizing the consequences. In addition to this, manchineel sap is incredibly poisonous as well, irritating the eyes and causing skin inflammation thanks to latex in its leaves and bark. What really helps to sum up how deadly the manchineel plant can be is the fact that Carib Indians used to use the sap of manchineel to poison the tips of their arrows. The only good thing about this plant is that it seems to polish furniture really well. They can grow to be up to 12 meters tall with a 2-foot thick trunk when fully grown.
Clathrus archeri. At first glance, Clathrus archeri, also known as octopus stinkhorn, maybe I'll call it that, looks like a hand coming out of the ground, like some kind of nightmarish cemetery scene. The reality might be a little less frightening. Here's a hint, it's fungus. But it's still not a plant we recommend you touch. Treat it like it really is the hand from a corpse protruding from the ground and recoil in horror. The octopus stinkhorn is a lilac to brown fungus with 4 to 7 arms that curve outward with pinkish red wrinkles. They grow in shaded gardens, plant nurseries, and moist areas. They also tend to thrive during the humid, warmer months of the year. While the octopus stinkhorn is not poisonous, it's just not very nice. Imagine dinner from the worst cook in your family, but 10 times more awful. They are edible in the egg stage, but the fetid smell of decaying flesh is enough to put you off even giving them a nibble. The scent is that awful that flies linger around this fungus. Most people don't even want this fungus in their garden, let alone on their dinner plate. Stinging nettle. We have a love-hate relationship with stinging nettle. On the one hand, we don't want to touch it, but on the other, we know it can give some fantastic health benefits, so we kinda want to. Stinging nettle is a perennial plant that, as the name suggests, causes stinging when you touch it. The stems and leaves of the plant have little hairs that pierce the skin and cause itchy, burning rashes that can last up to half a day in humans. Some animals fare a little worse, with some dogs having been poisoned by running through large thickets of stinging nettle, which can grow over 6 feet tall. But even though they're a nasty plant that causes no end of discomfort, they are also quite good for you. When you boil the young plants, you can form an herbal medicine or create ingredients for use in cosmetics and textiles. Some people also use the roots as a diuretic, and the leaves for tea to treat diabetes, gout, arthritis, and hay fever. So we're not gonna say don't touch stinging nettle, but we are gonna say at least wear gloves. Porcupine tomato. Most people have a love-hate relationship with the porcupine tomato, and all we can tell you is that its name is very fitting. It goes by the name of lychee tomato, or Morel de bulbus, and has been a firm family favorite in America since the 19th century. The lychee tomato produces dark red, cherry-sized tomatoes that have a rich and unusual sour cherry flavor. Given how palatable they are the preferred choice for sorbets, wine, sauce, jam, and even fruit tarts. So if this tomato is is so delicious and versatile, then why shouldn't you touch it? Well, you can, but you're gonna get injured. It's not called a porcupine tomato for no reason. While the tomato itself is harmless, it's the thorny casing that causes all the problems. The plant and tomato tops are covered in thorns, which makes it a less than fun experience to pick them when the time is right. Such is their discomfort that people even grow them just to stop animals from venturing into their vegetable gardens. We're sure you can understand now why some people have a difficult relationship with this.
Tread softly. Tread softly is sometimes mistakenly referred to as a nettle, as it does share many of the same characteristics, but it's actually a member of the nightshade family. It's also called a horse nettle or Carolina horse nettle. Our personal favorite title is the devil's tomato. Its leaves alternate between being oblong and oval-shaped, with each being irregularly lobed and coarsely toothed. What's most important here is that, like a nettle, both the tops and bottoms of its leaves are covered with fine hairs. Every single part of this plant is poisonous for the most part, including its fruit, which somewhat resembles a tomato to the uninitiated. One blue-flowered variant even has petals that resemble those of the tomato flower. Many people have died accidentally ingesting this fruit, but the entire plant is packed with solanine glycoalkaloids. These alkaloids are toxic and can cause fever, headache, scratchy throat, nausea, vomiting, and to top it off, diarrhea. Even worse, ingesting the fruit itself can cause circulatory and respiratory distress, eventually leading to death in extreme cases. These plants grow like weeds and can be found in all types of habitats, often dominating any landscape they take over. People who try to remove the plants.
Fraxinella. Fraxinella. It's not a very telling name for a plant, is it? It doesn't tell you whether it's poisonous, whether it has any secrets, whether you can eat it, use it, or smell it. But you will certainly work out what this plant has to hide before long. Fraxinella, also known as the gas plant, is a plant from the citrus family that's native to North America, Asia, and Southern Europe. Unlike its citrus family relatives, this plant will only produce blossoms, but it has a few cards up its sleeves to play so that it's not as dull as it might sound. During intense heat in the summer months, the Fraxinella plant will release oils that smell like lemon. If you touch these oils, you'll likely experience uncomfortable contact dermatitis. Fortunately, this will go away over time. But it's not the uncomfortable rash that makes this a strange plant that you shouldn't touch. The oils it releases are incredibly volatile. Want to know how much? They can ignite. All it takes is a hot day and this plant throws a tantrum. It will ignite into a fireball and quickly dies away as if nothing has happened. No one knows for sure how this plant manages to go about its business after having just burst into flames, but you certainly don't want to be near it when it happens. Death Camas. Death Camas. Well, the name is pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? Out of all the springtime plants to grace the planet, the Death Camas is one of the worst. And we're not being dramatic, it is a real pain. The Death Camas is a plant that you can find in British Columbia all the way to southwestern Saskatchewan. Its similarity to onion bulbs has resulted in many accidental poisonings, and animals have died because they don't know any better. Eating the bulbs, flowers, and flower buds can all result in poisoning. Not only is this plant poisonous to humans, but to poultry, bees, cattle, sheep, horses, and the list goes on. Basically, if anything eats this plant, they're gonna get sick. Poisoning symptoms can vary from one animal and human to the next. Humans, especially children, often experience problems with breathing, low blood pressure, diarrhea, drowsiness, dilated pupils, and vomiting. A coma and death have been known to follow. Manchineel tree. The manchineel tree may be endangered, but if you eat any fruit from it, you might be extinct. This rare tropical plant is one of the most poisonous trees on Earth, and it's found in South Florida, Central America, Northern South America, and the Caribbean. Fortunately, it's rare, and many trees have signs attached to them to warn people of the risks. So what are the risks of eating fruit from the manchineel tree or touching it? Unfortunately, someone had to find out firsthand so we could know, and we feel pretty bad about that. Radiologist Nicola Strickland wrote an article in the British Medical Journal about what she experienced. She took a bite from a piece of fruit and noticed a peppery feeling in her mouth. That feeling intensified until it became burning, tearing, and tight. After a couple of hours, she could barely swallow, and the excruciating pain offered the sense of an obstructive pharyngeal lump. The apples on the tree are toxic, and we now know thanks to Nicola. But so are all parts of the tree. The bark, leaves, and sap are all dangerous. They can scorch your skin and even damage the paint on cars. Fortunately, contact with this tree is not always fatal, but it can be, so why take the risk? Stay far, far away. Castor oil plant. Whether you ingest, inject, or inhale ricin from the seeds of the castor oil plant, you're not gonna have a good time. To be honest, that's a little bit of an understatement. You're gonna have an awful time. It's important to understand that the castor oil plant itself is not the problem. The plant is ornamental and appears throughout the Western world, and it's necessary for the production of castor oil. But the protein in the seeds of the castor oil plant is so toxic that it was once almost used as a war weapon. Ricin is a toxic protein that stops your body from being able to make its own protein. As a result, your body can shut down. If you do survive ricin poisoning, organ damage is typical. Those who ingest ricin can experience vomiting and diarrhea, dehydration, a bloody cough, fluid in the lungs, and eventual failure of organs before death. Fortunately, the accidental ingestion of ricin from the castor oil plant is rare. You would have to take the mash mixture of castor oil seeds and carry out the process of chromatography, including dissolving it in liquid or gas, to produce it. It's not something you can create by accident. English yew tree. The English yew tree is a beautiful ornamental tree to look at, but just to look at. Whatever you do, don't touch it. Every part of this tree, aside from the outer red flesh of the berries that grow on it, is poisonous. The bark, needles, inner berry seed, the lot. Taxine alkaloids are present in most parts of this tree, and as little as 50 grams of yew needles can be enough to be fatal. Those who consume more than that amount go into cardiogenic shock and don't wake up, even after resuscitation attempts are made. Once ingested, there is thought to be no therapy that exists to stop death from eventually happening. Extracorporeal membrane oxygen therapy has appeared as a treatment for some patients, but it's not known whether it was effective due to a non-fatal dose or because it's a surefire antidote. The best way to avoid being poisoned by this English yew tree is just not to eat it. Given that it's not food, hopefully that won't prove too challenging to manage. It's probably now time to take stock of your garden and see what hidden dangers are lurking within. Have you seen any of these plants in person or have any of them at home? It might be time to get rid of them once and for all. Also, check out our other cool stuff showing up on screen right now. See you next time.